that in the temperate regions, like Britain for instance, there had been a prior agricultural revolution owing to which the land productivity had increased significantly. That he argues, for instance, that it was not so much the difference in the land-man ratio, but the fact that there was more output per unit of land that actually caused this higher wage that prevailed, and of course the high wage migration that occurred in the tropical regions. The example he gives, for instance, is that a unit of land in England could actually produce about 1,500 pounds of wheat, while a unit of land in India could produce about 700 pounds of wheat. An acre of land could produce. So that there is a clear difference in productivity in the 19th century between these two units of land. But in that, what Arthur Lewis, as distinguished economist Arthur Lewis, forgets is that if you look at the income from a unit of land for a year as a whole, income has to be over a period of time. Income is a flow. A flow is for a period of time. If you look at the income per unit of land over a period of time, the tropical lands were far more productive per acre because they grew 3 crops. The wheat he's talking about would then be followed by another crop and another crop, so that if you added up the total productivity of an acre of land for the year as a whole, it was much higher than what you find in the temperate regions. As a result, the reason for the wage differences have to be located not in the prior fact of an agricultural revolution, but they have to be located somewhere else. They have to be located, for instance, in the fact that the areas that the migrants went to, they got rid of the local population, set themselves up as farmers on the land that they obtained, and obtained higher incomes, because of which their reservation wages were higher. So the point is that depending upon our reading of the natural habitats, the theories should be developed, but if our reading is wrong and the theories are wrong, and consequently the social implications of this fact of man acting on nature are something which are wrongly read. I'll give you a second example. The second example, for instance, very well known. By the way, all of trade theory, as you know, is based on the assumption of identical production possibilities across all countries. On the other hand, that is something which is palpably wrong, because not all countries can produce all goods. Even David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage is something which is really based on a complete misreading of this situation. Ricardo is talking about the fact that, if you remember his famous example, England and Portugal, England produces cloth, Portugal produces wine, and have comparative advantage in these productions, and therefore trade is beneficial because Portugal would then concentrate on wine production, England would concentrate on cloth production. But on the other hand, the fact remains that the presupposition of Ricardo's theory is that all countries can produce all goods. If all countries can produce all goods, then it is better for some countries to specialize in some goods than for other and for other countries to specialize in other goods. In other words, compared to a free trade situation, we can unambiguously say that trade is beneficial only when all countries produced all goods beforehand, while some countries specialize after trade. Again, therefore, the Ricardian theory of competitive advantage is palpably wrong, because Ricardo does not recognize the fact that actually the natural habitats in which production takes place is such that only certain kinds of production takes place in some countries, other kinds of production, and that kind of production cannot take place in other countries. So the basic assumption that all countries produce all goods is wrong. And of course, this is obviously true of the Hexerolian theorem, which basically assumes identical production possibilities across all countries. But there is a second aspect of this fact that labor acts together with nature, labor acts upon nature in order to produce. And that is the fact that since nature is not reproducible in the sense that you cannot really have, like we talk about the capital stock remaining intact. We cannot really talk about production that leaves nature intact. Nature cannot be subject to a process of simple reproduction while there is an expanded reproduction in the production of material wealth that is taking place. This in turn has very important implications. One of which, as Vice Chancellor was talking about, is the fact that there is exhaustibility of resources. It's also to do with the fact that there is a change as far as nature is concerned, which has all kinds of implications. Natural implications, which we now know in terms of global warming, climate change, and so on. But there is a social implication of exhaustibility, which again is something which is very rarely recognized in economics. That social implication is the following: that if you have an exhaustible resource, in that case, you find that the exhaustible resource would generally be in the face of expanded reproduction or expanded production of wealth. The fact of exhaustibility would impart what one may call an increasing supply price. That basically it becomes more and more difficult to get hold of an extra amount of it, or even if it is not more and more difficult, at some point an oil well ceases to produce any oil. At some point there is an exhaustion of these resources and you have to move somewhere else. So the point is that exhaustibility obviously introduces a certain constraint upon production. And this constraint typically can be theorized as an increasing supply price, which is what Keynes actually did in his Economic Consequences of the Peace. Ricardo did in his Theory of Diminishing Returns. But on the other hand, this exhaustibility being associated with increasing supply price would also mean that with increasing supply price, you would find that there would be, if the increasing in supply price is in money terms, and if money wages are given, you would find that inflation would occur, and the occurring of inflation would basically make the economy dysfunctional. Therefore, there is a way in which exhaustibility is sought to be tackled throughout the history of capitalism, and that is by excluding other users of the exhaustible resources. That if it is the case with a limited amount of oil, then make sure that nobody else uses the oil, it's available to me. Similarly, a very important example of an exhaustible resource is, as I mentioned, for instance, the tropical landmass. The tropical landmass is capable of producing. The whole of industrial revolution in Britain began with the cotton textile industry, but Britain can't produce cotton. So how did you have an industrial revolution occurring in Britain on the basis of a raw material that is not reproducible at all in Britain itself? Obviously, that raw material is producible only in tropical and subtropical regions, from which it had to be brought, and therefore it becomes essential for the industrial powers to depend upon a steady supply of these commodities from the tropical and subtropical regions. But the tropical and subtropical regions of the world have always been densely populated, and as a result, there is very little land that remains unutilized. Even if some had remained unutilized before, like in Mughal India, they soon become utilized, and consequently, how do you ensure that a larger and larger supply of all kinds of foodstuffs and inputs and beverages and so on is made available to the capitalist segment of the world, which is essentially, fundamentally located in the temperate regions? How do you ensure that as that segment grows, since the income elasticity of demand for these tropical products are positive, demand for these products grows, but at the same time, the tropical land is fixed? How do you ensure that more and more of it is available? You could say that even if land supply is fixed, nonetheless, you can have land augmenting practices of various kinds. Irrigation is one such land augmenting practice where, even though the land supply is fixed, you can actually raise the output per unit of land, and that is what I mean by land augmenting. Now, one of the most remarkable facts about all land augmenting practices and technological progress in tropical agriculture is the fact that all of it requires the intervention of the state. Now, this is a very important fact which was recognized by Marx long ago, who had said that all Eastern empires had basically three main ministries. There was the Ministry of Revenue, which was extracting surplus domestically. There was a Ministry of War, which was extracting surplus through plunder externally. And there was a Ministry of Irrigation, because irrigation was very basic to the fact of the sustenance and expansion of tropical agriculture. But of course, in capitalism, there is a tendency towards ensuring that the state does not directly intervene in production practices. Even if the state did, there would be a certain limit to the land augmentation that could come about. But on the other hand, if the state does not, for instance, under the gold standard, the state was supposed to balance its budget. Again, today, under neoliberal capitalism, the state, if not supposed to balance its budget, cannot run more than a 3% fiscal deficit. So there is a certain tendency under capitalism to ensure that the state does not play a proactive role in any kind of investment activity, and of course such investment activities, since they're essential as far as tropical agriculture is concerned for land augmentation, that forecloses even such possibilities of land augmentation as exist. By the way, there was a German intellectual who actually wrote a book